Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at Taiwan, specifically its history and current situation.
Sounds complicated.
It is, definitely. But luckily we have a great guide to help us through it, a book called The Struggle for Taiwan, A History of America, China, and the Island Caught Between.
By Sulmaan Wasif Khan.
That's right. And before we jump in, maybe you could give us a little background on the author.
Sure. Sulmaan Wasif Khan is, well, a historian.
Okay.
He wrote a book before this one called Haunted by Chaos, China's Grand Strategy from Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping.
That sounds right up his alley. So with all that expertise, what's this book all about?
This book, it really dives deep into, well, how Taiwan ended up in the situation it's in today.
The book starts with the Cairo Conference, right? Back in 1943.
Right. Chapter 1, The Making of the Taiwan Problem.
Okay. The Making of the Taiwan Problem, 1943 to 1953. So what happened at this conference? Why was it so important for Taiwan?
Well, it's where they basically decided, well, one of the things they decided was what would happen to Taiwan after the war.
I see. And who was they?
Oh, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek.
Chiang Kai-shek. He was the leader of,
The Republic of China.
right, the ROC.
And, well, he wanted Taiwan back. It had been under Japanese rule for 50 years by then.
So the Cairo Declaration, that came out of this conference. What did it say about Taiwan?
Basically, it promised that after World War II, territories taken by Japan would be returned to China, including Taiwan.
So seems straightforward enough. What's the problem then?
Well, it wasn't as simple as it sounded. For one thing, Taiwan had developed quite differently from mainland China, even when it was part of the Qing dynasty.
In what way?
Taiwan had its own, well, its own unique culture and identity. And then there was the fact that after the first Sino-Japanese War,
Which was when?
back in 1895, anyway, after that war, Taiwan was actually ceded to Japan. Yes, permanently. So China's claim to Taiwan, well, it wasn't a simple case of just taking back a lost province.
So there were already layers of complexity even before the Cairo Declaration.
Right. And then you've got the Chinese Civil War happening at the same time.
Right, between the communists and the nationalists.
Exactly. And in 1949, the communists, led by Mao Zedong, they won. They established the People's Republic of China.
The PRC.
Yeah, the PRC. And Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist forces, the Kuomintang or KMT, they fled to Taiwan.
So now you have two rival governments, both claiming to be the real China.
Exactly. One in control of the mainland, the other in control of Taiwan. A real mess.
And this is where the U.S. starts to get involved, right?
Right. The U.S., they've been involved in China since the 18th century. But the Cold War, that really changed things.
The U.S. was determined to stop the spread of communism, and they
Oh.
saw Taiwan as well as a key part of that strategy.
Right. But even before that, there were already, tensions between the mainland Chinese government in Taiwan and the Taiwanese people themselves.
So like internal conflict as well as external pressure.
Exactly. And then in 1947, things boiled over. There was this brutal crackdown on protests by the KMT, what became known as the 228 incident.
The 228 incident, what happened?
It was a really horrific event. The KMT, they cracked down hard on anyone protesting against their rule. A lot of people died.
Sounds awful.
It was, and it really showed how deep the divisions were.
So even within Taiwan, you had this sense of a separate identity, a Taiwanese identity that was being suppressed.
Exactly. And that event, it really fueled the pro-independence movement that we see today.
Right. So we've got competing governments, rising tensions within Taiwan, and the U.S. getting involved in the mix. What happens next?
Well, in the middle of all this, George Kennan, this American diplomat, he proposes a pretty radical idea.
Radical how?
He suggests a UN trusteeship for Taiwan, basically a path towards independence.
Wow. So
Yeah.
why did that happen?
It would have been a huge commitment for the U.S. They weren't ready for that. They were focused on containing communism. Supporting Chiang Kai-shek, even with all his problems, seemed like the easiest way to do that.
So another path not taken.
And then, to make things even more complicated, the Korean War breaks out in 1950.
Oh, right. That changes everything.
It does. President Truman, he decides to protect Taiwan from a potential communist takeover.
So the U.S. is even more deeply involved now.
Exactly. And then there's the Treaty of San Francisco in 1951, which was supposed to formally end World War II with Japan.
Okay.
But because of the Chinese Civil War, the treaty didn't actually say who Taiwan belonged to. It was left kind of hanging.
So now we've got the Chinese Civil War unresolved, the U.S. deeply involved, and Taiwan's legal status totally up in the air.
A recipe for disaster, you might say. And that's where we leave off with Chapter 1. The stage is set for all the drama to come. Okay, so Chapter 2 is called Choosing Between Two Tyrannies.
Kitschy title. What years does that cover?
It's 1953 to 1971.
Okay, so right after the Korean War and that whole treaty situation.
Yeah, basically. This chapter really focuses on, well, on Chiang Kai-shek and how he managed to stay in power in Taiwan.
Sounds like he had a lot on his plate.
He did. There were people within his own party, the KMT, who wanted his job.
Internal rivals.
Exactly. And then, of course, you had people in Taiwan who wanted independence.
They didn't want to be ruled by the KMT, let alone be part of mainland China.
Right, right. So Chiang had to kind of play both sides. He needed the U.S. to back him up, but he also had to keep a lid on things within Taiwan itself.
Sounds like a tough balancing act.
It was. He ended up using pretty authoritarian tactics, cracking down on dissent, and basically creating a one-party state.
That's ironic, isn't it?
It is, kind of. He was fighting against Communist China, another one-party state, but he was using similar methods to stay in power.
Khan makes that point, doesn't he? That the U.S. was so focused on containing communism that they sometimes overlooked the flaws of their allies.
He does. It was all about the bigger picture, the global struggle against communism, and sometimes the details, well, they got swept aside.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Except sometimes that friend, well, isn't so friendly.
Exactly. And then you've got these two major crises that erupt in the Taiwan Strait.
Crises, like military confrontations.
Yeah. The first one, the first Taiwan Strait crisis, happened in 1954.
What happened?
China started shelling these islands, Kinmen and Matsu. They were held by the ROC, but they were really close to the mainland.
A show of force.
Exactly. A way of saying, hey, we're still here and we haven't forgotten about Taiwan.
And how did the U.S. react to that?
They got serious.
Yes.
They signed the U.S.-ROC Mutual Defense Treaty with Taiwan that same year.
So now the U.S. is formally committed to defending Taiwan.
Yep. A major turning point. Drew a line in the sand.
But it also made the Taiwan Strait a potential flashpoint for a bigger conflict.
Definitely. And then, just a few years later, the second Taiwan Strait crisis.
When was that?
1958. And again, it starts with China shelling Kinmen and Matsu.
So, same old story.
Sort of. But this time, the U.S. was already deeply involved in the Vietnam War. Things were a lot more tense.
The world must have been holding its breath.
You know, Khan actually says that Eisenhower considered using nuclear weapons against China.
Nuclear weapons? Seriously?
Yeah. Crazy, right. But that's how high the stakes were. The U.S. was absolutely determined to contain communism.
So they were willing to risk a nuclear war to stop China from taking Taiwan.
It seems that way. It's kind of terrifying when you think about it, how close we came to, well, to something truly horrific.
A nuclear war. It's barely even imaginable. But luckily that didn't happen. Things calmed down eventually.
Right, a combination of things, I think. But Khan points to the Warsaw talks in 1962 as a key factor.
The Warsaw talks, I thought those were mostly about Laos.
They were, but they also provided this opportunity for the U.S. and China to talk directly.
Even though they were in the middle of a Cold War.
Right, and even though they weren't talking specifically about Taiwan, those talks helped to reduce the risk of miscalculation.
Just having a channel of communication open, even if it's back channel, can make a big difference.
It can. It helps to clarify intentions, to build some level of trust, even when there are huge disagreements.
Diplomacy and communication, even when they're tough, can prevent things from spiraling out of control.
That's the lesson, I think. And this whole period with the crises and the near misses, it really highlights something that Khan keeps coming back to. Human choices.
The idea that history isn't inevitable, that it's shaped by the decisions people make.
Exactly. And he argues that the U.S. policy of containment, it often led to short-term thinking.
They were so focused on stopping communism that they didn't always think about the long-term consequences of their actions.
Right. And that's how they ended up supporting Chiang Kai-shek, even though his regime was, well, pretty authoritarian.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend, even if that friend isn't exactly a saint.
That's the dilemma. And those decisions, well, they had ripple effects that lasted for decades, shaped the whole relationship between the U.S., China, and Taiwan.
Every action has a reaction.
This whole period set the stage for what comes next, the 1970s, and a major shift in U.S.-China relations.
It sounds like the story's just getting more complicated.
It is, but that's the thing about history, isn't it? It's never simple.
Just briefly, we want to say thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please remember to like and subscribe to support our channel. Thank you. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already. From the Cairo Conference to the Cold War, the Taiwan Strait crises, a lot of tension, a lot of close calls.
Yeah, a lot of what-ifs along the way.
Exactly. And now we're in this new era with China rising, the pandemic shaking things up, everything feeling even more precarious.
Right. And Khan, in this last chapter, he doesn't shy away from that. He dives right into those what-ifs, those potential futures for Taiwan.
So where does he even begin with that? I mean, so many factors at play, so much uncertainty.
Well, he starts by challenging some of the assumptions people often make about, well, about how we got here. The whole idea that the U.S. and China are on this inevitable collision course.
The Thucydides trap, right? A rising power challenging the established order.
Yeah. He doesn't say it's impossible, but he argues that it's not, well, it's not a guarantee either.
So there's still room for choice, for things to go differently than, well, than that kind of doom and gloom scenario.
That's what he's saying. He points to specific decisions, specific moments where things could have gone another way.
Like what? What kind of decisions?
Well, like the U.S. deciding to protect Taiwan during the Korean War made sense at the time, Cold War logic and all that. But it also kind of locked the U.S. into this commitment to Taiwan, a commitment that's, well, it's a lot harder to maintain now.
Right, with China so much more powerful than they were back then.
Exactly. And he argues that the U.S., well, they haven't always been super clear about why they're supporting Taiwan. Strategic ambiguity can be helpful sometimes, but it can also lead to confusion and misinterpretation.
Mixed messages, you might say.
Right. And then there's the whole normalization of relations with China in the 70s. Important step for sure. But it also created this weird situation where the U.S. was trying to be friends with both China and Taiwan, even though they were, well, they weren't exactly friends with each other.
A bit of a diplomatic juggling act, it sounds like.
It was, and it's getting harder and harder to keep those balls in the air.
So with all that as background, what does Khan actually say about those potential futures for Taiwan? What are the options?
He lays out a few scenarios. One is that China tries to absorb Taiwan, but not through a military invasion.
So like a more subtle approach.
Yeah. Economic pressure, political influence, that kind of thing.
Make Taiwan so dependent on the mainland that they have no choice but to, well, to eventually come back into the fold.
Right. But he also says that, well, that's probably not going to work.
Why not?
Because of Hong Kong.
Right.
The crackdown there, the national security law, it's made people in Taiwan, well, a lot more skeptical of China's promises.
The one country, two systems model, it's not looking so appealing anymore.
Exactly. So Khan thinks that peaceful unification, well, it's not very likely.
So what's the alternative? Or I guess the worst case scenario.
A Chinese invasion, a full-blown military attack.
The one everyone's worried about.
Yeah. And he doesn't sugarcoat it. He says the costs of such a war would be enormous for everyone involved.
Widespread devastation, global economic disruption, the whole thing.
Right. But he also says that the outcome, well, it's not guaranteed. Taiwan has been building up its defenses, and with U.S. support, they could put up a pretty strong fight.
So it wouldn't be a walkover for China.
Definitely not. But even if China doesn't launch a deliberate attack, there's still the risk of, well, of an accident.
Miscalculation, misinterpretation, something spiraling out of control.
Right. The tensions are so high, the mistrust is so deep that it wouldn't take much for things to, well, to go very wrong.
So even if no one wants a war, it could still happen.
That's the scary part. And then there's this third scenario, one that doesn't get talked about as much.
What's that?
Taiwan declaring independence, formally, officially saying they're a separate country.
That would be a huge gamble.
It would. China has said they'd consider that an act of war.
But it's not impossible,
Mm-hmm.
especially if they feel like they're running out of options.
Right. If they feel like China's closing in on them and the U.S. can't or won't protect them, they might decide they have no choice but to, well, to go all in.
So 3 scenarios, all of them with risks, all of them with potential consequences that are, well, pretty terrifying. So what does Khan say the U.S. should do? I mean, how do we navigate this mess?
He says the U.S. needs to get serious, stop with the mixed messages, the ambiguity, figure out what they want, what their goals are, and then be clear about it.
Clarity, consistency, that's what he's calling for.
Right. And he says they need to engage with China, but not just on trade or climate change. They need to talk about security, about Taiwan, about the things that are, well, that are really causing the problems.
Dialogue, even when it's tough, is better than just ignoring the issues.
Exactly. And he says the U.S. needs to work with its allies, build a stronger, more unified front in the region.
Strengthen numbers. Show China that there would be consequences for aggression.
Right. But it's not just about military stuff. He also talks about diplomacy. about finding ways to cooperate with China where it's possible.
So it's not about picking sides, about being pro-China or pro-Taiwan. It's about, well, it's about finding a way to manage this relationship so that things don't spiral out of control.
Exactly. And he says Taiwan needs to be proactive too. Strengthen their defenses, diversify their economy, build those international partnerships.
Don't just rely on the U.S. to bail them out.
Right. And he also talks about the importance of people-to-people connections, cultural exchanges, building bridges between Taiwan and the mainland.
Finding common ground, building understanding, even when there's so much tension at the government level.
It's a long game, but it's worth playing. Because ultimately, peace is in everyone's interest.
And that's really Khan's main point, isn't it? That the future is not predetermined. We have choices, and those choices will determine whether we end up with peace or conflict.
That's what he's saying. And he's urging us to choose wisely, to learn from the mistakes of the past, and to find a way to build a better future.
Well, that's a message I think we can all get behind. We've explored a lot in this deep dive, from the historical roots of the Taiwan issue to the potential futures that lie ahead. It's a complex and challenging topic, but it's one that we can't afford to ignore. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and we hope you'll continue to explore this issue and engage in these crucial conversations.